And I'm very pleased to be here. This has, the topic for today has, of course, been agitating many of us. I presume many of you, like many of us at Harvard and many of us in Massachusetts, for the last little while. And so it's great to have an opportunity to, has been fun to have an opportunity to put my ideas about it together in a sort of organized fashion. And one of the dominant themes is that this little flurry of controversy is not the first, and in fact we're kind of just one more step in a long history of pendulum swings back and forth. And I think ultimately the goal of the discussions today would be to figure out not who's right, but just how to narrow the arc of those pendulum swings, how to get it swinging less quickly and less extremely over time. So the current public discourse, as you know, is much of it touched off in 2018 or 2019 by Emily Hanford, is organized around this claim of a crisis in fourth grade reading, and goes on to an argument about the causes or the symptoms of that crisis, and has led to new legislative action and a lot of parental activism in one order or the other. And the solution for all of this is this term, which I have to put into air quotes and real quotes if you're reading it, the science of reading. Excuse me. There's a little pollution in the air. I have water. I have. So let's just review the claims. The crisis in fourth grade reading, which is much talked about. Now, I don't want to claim that I'm happy about the state of reading in the US. I mean, there are a lot of kids who don't learn to read as quickly enough, well enough. But the notion of a crisis suggests that something awful has just happened, right? And if you just look at the data, the NAEP data from starting many years ago, actually, reading was improving very slightly, gradually, marginally, up to a couple of years ago. And then we had COVID. And the effect of COVID was that the schools, many kids were out of school or had interrupted or partial or less satisfactory schooling for a couple of years, and reading scores went down a few points. That's perhaps a much more legitimately claimed crisis, but what does that demonstrate? To me, that demonstrates that the schools weren't doing such a bad job. It's better to have them than not. And kids out of school were, in fact, missing out on effective instruction. So the crisis talk, I think, is overblown for strategic reasons. And then we get on to discussing what the causes or the symptoms are of, let's not call it a crisis, but of, say, a generally less than wonderful performance by American kids in reading. That less than wonderful performance is defined by NAEP cutoff points, which are, of course, somewhat arbitrary. What's the difference between basic and below basic? What's the difference between proficient and basic? A bunch of people sitting around a room decided what that was, but we'll take it as given that half the kids in the country really can't read at an advanced or highly proficient level. And is that because they've all been taught with methods that rely too much on the 3 Qs and the 3 queuing system, or they've been taught to skip hard words, or their teachers have never been taught anything about how to teach reading? And I'm skeptical that any of those 3 things is itself, or that all of them in combination are an explanation. I will confess, I'm not a fan of the 3 queuing system. I'm not a fan of telling kids they can skip hard words, although it's what I do when I read pharmaceutical labels. And I think the claims about the failures of teacher education are simply unfounded in data. We really don't know what's going on in teacher education in very many parts of the country, just as we don't know what's going on in first grade classrooms in many parts of the country. So claims that this challenge of improving reading has to do with poor reading instruction really ought to be buttressed by establishing a systematic research effort to see what early grade reading instruction looks like. We haven't had that, and we need it. But the consequence then has been the new legislative action in 30 states and district policy changes, such as in New York City. And the legislative action is happening over in many places. 31 states have passed some sort of legislative, some sort of bill with attention to reading instruction, what in many cases guidelines or strong guidelines or prohibitions around curricula. And that is, to some extent, a product of parental activism in the town I live in, which has one of the better long-term outcomes for reading in the state of Massachusetts, which has one of the better long-term outcomes in the country. The parents are all up in arms and are having weekly meetings about how to improve reading instruction. Legislative action, though, we really have to see that while we can understand why people might move toward that, it has some really serious potential dangers. First of all, the legislators don't know what they're talking about, right? I mean, this is, they often pass provisions which are misguided and overly inflexible. And I will remind those of you who are approaching my age that in 2000 there was a federal legislation that prescribed and proscribed reading curricula in association with the No Child Left Behind or Reading First bills. And that turned into an unholy mess, including lots of accusations, some of them shown to be correct, around financial and friendship relationships between the legislators or the lobbyists and the programs that were recommended. So this is a very dangerous territory to get into. Secondly, the real challenge is that American schooling is locally governed for a very good reason, that there are a lot of differences across the 15,000 school districts in the country, and legislative action at the state level does not take those local conditions into account. So it typically has very negative impact on the underfunded districts, which are being given unfunded mandates to do new things. It's possible in many of these legislative efforts to request waivers, which is, of course, a wonderful thing for your principal or your reading coach to spend several weeks doing in September when they should be organizing reading instruction for the year. There's just no attention to the variation across classrooms as well as across schools in these legislative mandates. General purpose policies put individual teachers at risk. If there are policies that say, no, this is not an allowable practice, and a principal walks in and hears a teacher engaging in that practice, perhaps not as a way of teaching, but as a very single point recovery option for a student, like, oh, wait a minute, Does that word make sense in that sentence? Right? And the principal says, no, 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 3Qing, we don't do that. Right? That's the kind of thing that can really distort the relationship between educational leaders and educational practitioners, and can put teachers at risk and can undermine teacher autonomy. General purpose policies, I think, almost always end up pushing that pendulum too far in one direction or the other. It's hard to do well-nuanced legislation about these things. And so what we end up with is too much time focused on whatever the legislation prefers it be focused on, curricular emphases going too far in that direction, and assessment priorities reflecting those curricular and time distribution priorities. So, is the science of reading the solution? Is the science of reading the solution? Well, I will claim here that there is no science of reading, as most science of reading adherents interpret it. And if you think that's an extreme claim because I'm a wishy-washy, sort of insufficiently scientifically committed person, that link there is to a blog post by Mark Seidenberg, who says the same thing. I mean, there's, of course, a lot of science about reading. There's science about the processes, both psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic processes that occur when kids are reading or adults are reading. There's a lot of science that has documented normal reading development. There's a lot of science that has helped identify the precursors to success in reading outcomes. But the science and the science of reading is like science in Scientology. I mean, it's just using the term for rhetorical purposes. And in any case, even if there were a science of reading, or even if you believe there is a science of reading, it isn't the science of reading we need. The science of how kids read does not get you directly to how kids should be taught to read. So what we do need is the science of teaching reading, and that's where we have no data, right? We don't actually know what's going on in 15,000 school districts in teaching reading. We don't actually know how the different approaches to teaching reading interact, have outcomes that are differentiated for different subgroups of kids or different individual kids. So we should be demanding that attention be diverted to the science of teaching reading, because that's where the action ought to be. So here's my brief idiosyncratic history. I mean, I don't know whether this is meant to cheer us up, like this has been going on a long time, or to depress us further, because like this has been going on a long time. As Tom mentioned, I was the chair of a national reading, a national Academy of Sciences committee that was asked to, I have to chuckle when I think back on it. They came to me and they said, well, we want to put together this committee because there's so much research now about reading and we think we can end the reading wars. And I said, but I don't do research on reading instruction. And they said, that's why you have to chair the committee, because anybody who's done research on reading instruction is disqualified from chairing it. And we ended up writing a report, which I thought was rather good, which identified 3 key opportunities that kids need if they're going to be successful readers. Opportunity to develop positive affect toward reading, toward literacy, the motivation to be literate, in other words. Opportunities to develop broad and deep language skills, and I would actually modify that now and add knowledge, broad content knowledge. And opportunities to both grasp, in other words, be let in on the secret of, and master, in other words, practice enough with the alphabetic principle. And that report, called Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, came out, and it was actually quite influential for a couple of years. It was adopted by many states as the basis for their reading professional development. But then 2 years later, the and then 2 years later, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development report, the reading panel report, emerged, and it was very similar in some ways. There was no conflict in the recommendations from the two reports, but the emphases were clearly different. The National Reading Panel, the Chartreuse one there, emphasized experimental evidence, experimental and quasi-experimental evidence, and it emphasized studies about instruction and reading outcomes, whereas the Preventing Reading Difficulties report took a much broader, more developmental view of literacy, included attention to early childhood, included attention to social conditions, and ended up making recommendations that were that were focused on opportunities to learn rather than prescriptions for teaching. It was a much more integrative developmental approach, and we included explicit recommendations around early childhood and extracurricular activities. The National Reading Panel report had sort of started from the componential view of reading, starting in kindergarten with a lot of evidence, a lot of emphasis on kindergarten, first, second grade. And because it was constrained to experimental and quasi-experimental evidence, of which there was not that much actually in 2000 when they produced the report, it ended up making recommendations for phonological awareness and phonics training that had actually, interestingly, that were based primarily on studies done with kids who were having trouble learning to read, because those were the kids who were available to participate in experimental studies. I mean, nobody does experimental studies on thriving kindergarten readers. They do it on second graders who haven't gotten the point yet. So now I think these two reports could have been seen as complementary, but they weren't for reasons that I will tell you if you get me drunk enough. One sort of unifying conceptualization that emerged during that period, though, in the late 80s, early 90s, was Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, which I think everybody is probably familiar with. I think it's a brilliant conceptualization of both the complexity of reading and that it's generally correct. And one of the things that's nice about it is even those science of reading adherents accept it. They like it. They use it. But I think it does kind of carry within it a bit of a kernel of what's so hard about achieving consensus here. So this is the reading rope for those of you who have never seen it. And it emphasizes that there are these strands of what I would call unconstrained skills, sort of the languagey side of it, the languagey, knowledgey side of things, that as they develop, get bound together and become increasingly strategic, and the strands of decoding relevant skills that get bound together and become increasingly automatic, and with practice become automatized. And that very dichotomy, I think, is the dichotomy that's the challenge for us, right? That it's like, are you on the top half or the bottom half of that? Which of those sets of skills do you want to focus on? Do you want to start with? Do you want to emphasize in your reading instructional program? And that's, for me, been a little bit of an organizing sort of metric, because, in fact, I think a lot of what is wrong with the conversations we're having, the public discourse around reading, is that where you put yourself at the top half or the bottom half of that diagram is not just a decision about how you start to teach reading in first grade. It's sort of a decision about who you are, about your identity, about lots of other things. But I'll come back to that. So, key moments in the history of the reading wars. One could go back to Greece for this, but I didn't. I decided to start in the 19th century with the McGuffey readers, which are, I will argue, were far more brilliant than anybody realized when they were using them in the 19th century, in the 19th and early 20th century. But the McGuffey readers, which was a pretty code-focused approach, a relatively code-focused approach, was, of course, opposed early on by John Dewey progressivism, the experience-based approach to all early instruction. And John Dewey won, I guess, and in the early 20th century, the whole word method dominated until 1955, when Rudolf Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read, and that launched a real critique of the whole word method, which was responded to, though, by a backlash that led to Ken Goodman presenting whole language. That led, in turn, to the 1990 efforts emblematized by the National Reading Panel report and the Reading First legislation. The backlash to that was the thing that we can't say anymore, balanced literacy, and that in turn has led to the science of reading. So we've had pretty rapid pendulum swings in recent times. But let's just take a look at the McGuffey readers, because they are wonderful. This is the first eclectic reader. This is the first grade reader. And it includes a phonics chart and simple words, decodable words, with pictures that could help you identify what those words are. A relatively banal text, which is almost inevitable if you're approaching reading instruction this way. I don't actually know, maybe if there's a historian of reading instruction here, I don't actually know whether that phonics chart was there for the kids or the teachers. But it's in the little book that kids had on their desks. Just to show, this is the primer, the previous book, actually, which starts with the lesson on the left, a mat, a cat, right? But lesson 25, sometime that, I don't know how quickly they went through these lessons, but sometime before the end of the first year, kids were reading texts that were as complicated as you see there, with words in them like grandmother and I don't know, work and other not extremely decodable words. But for me, going back over the McGuffey readers, which I used to own a whole set of, I don't know what happened to them, the introduction, their own justification for what they're doing, talks about a proper gradation. All new words are placed at the head of each unit, of each lesson, to be learned before their decoding is taught, right? So it is kind of a whole word method leading into a phonics method. It's the merging of meaning with code, utilized strategically. And then the kids took these texts that they had learned to read and they copied them on their slates. So it isn't exactly exciting writing instruction, but they were integrating writing instruction with reading instruction. Well, in the 50s, we had Dick and Jane, which was a very strong version of the whole word method. And the idea was that we'll only teach first graders 150 words or so, and they can learn to read them as whole word units, as recognize the patterns of the words. And often there are Well, here too, there's a hen, the word hen and the picture of the hen, but not everything in the picture is directly linked to, not everything in the text is directly readable from the picture. And here's another series of this. I put this in because a friend of mine, a former third grade teacher, was so lyrical about how much she loved Alice and Jerry when she was a kid in school. And Alice and Jerry series was so committed to the whole word method that in first grade, if they presented words, they needed words that they hadn't been taught with the whole word method, they used rebuses. So even very decodable words like hill and man and sun and trees are presented in this text on page, what is it? 6, as rebuses. And this is what Rudolf Flesch was reacting to, right? Rudolf Flesch had actually learned to read in German, transparent orthography, I would point out, and he thought this was ridiculous, and that's when he wrote the book that kind of tossed a bit of a grenade into these methods. So the whole word method, the advantage of it is that it does insist on a strong early emphasis on meaning, but the challenge then is, where do you go after you've convinced kids that they can read for meaning? They either have to be incredibly good at inference, which I would point out some kids are, some 20 or 30% of kids figure out, oh, hen, hair, heavy. I guess that's an H, and it makes a H sound, right? I mean, this is not an impossible inference for many kids, although it is a difficult inference for many kids. Or they need some explicit phonics teaching. Now, these whole word curricula actually introduced some phonics teaching in grade 2. We don't know to what degree that part of the instruction was fully implemented in grade 2 classrooms, but it was not absent from the curriculum. In other words, even these whole word folk conceded the need to teach something about the code, but they and the whole language people subsequently were focused on the difficulties, the flies in the ointment, so to speak. The fact that, first of all, many of the most frequent words in English have to be taught using the whole word method. You can't explain those to kids. You just have to say, learn them, memorize them, practice them, use flashcards, do whatever. They're not going to be vulnerable to decoding. English is thought of as a phonics-based language, but of course it isn't. It's really a morphologically based language, particularly as you move on a little bit. And that means that there's huge numbers of violations of simple grapheme-phoneme correspondences. So if you're going to actually do a good job of teaching kids to decode all of the words that they are going to need to be able to decode by the time they get to 5th or 6th grade, you have to teach morphology, you have to teach etymology, you have to teach a whole lot of tolerance for variability in pronunciation and in spelling. But that variability is rule governed, and it would be a mistake to teach it as if it's just stuff to be memorized. On the other hand, it requires a lot of knowledge of linguistics, actually, in order to teach it well. So, and these are the mistakes that I walk regularly by a dry cleaner that's called Lapel, and I always want to read it Lapel. I'm thinking, what does that mean? You need a lot of meaning to support reading in English, much more so than in more shallow orthographies. So both sides of the arguments have their points. That's why the argument persists, particularly in English, for so long. Meaning is motivating. Phonics is efficient. They are opposed in the rhetoric, but they don't really need to be opposed in practice. And the evidence of that is that McGuffey managed to merge them by teaching whole words and then teaching how to decode those whole words, and starting with easily decodable words, but moving on very quickly to more complex vocabulary. Nonetheless, the positions are polarized, and they are in the public discourse even more polarized than they are probably in our professional discourse. And I think that's a very bad thing. I think that bodes ill for resolution, for comity, for reintegration, supports to teachers that will help them integrate meaning with code in an effective way. So back to the reading rope, you've got the kind of meaning part of it, the meaning rope and the code rope. And the meaning rope is associated with unconstrained skills, progressive teaching, teacher autonomy. It's a left-wing approach. Who's willing to read a text and make sense of it and say, well, you can read it that way, but I want to read it this way, right? That's hermeneutics. That's anti-clerical. I grade out the Democrats, because I'm sure there are Democrats who don't buy all of that, but in general, that's the sort of the left-wing politics of it, whereas the constrained skills, the skills that enable you to read using decoding, to read decodable words that are susceptible to direct instruction, that's the right wing. That's exegesis. That's reading the text the way it's there. That's evangelicalism, and that's republicanism. And it will perhaps not be surprising in light of this greatly exaggerated dichotomization of the world that McGuffey readers in PDF have had a vast resurgence because they're being used by homeschoolers, who, needless to say, fall mostly on the bottom end of that. So that's how I see the challenge, the problem, and I guess what the question is, what's likely to happen now? I think the pendulum is swinging too far to the right, that legislative constraints on reading are being widely adopted, and they are succeeding in re-emphasizing phonics. I think that the hermeneutic approaches are being banned, obviously, and early reading scores may rise. First and second grade reading scores may rise as a result. I don't know that later reading scores will rise because, in fact, part of what that does is it diverts a lot of time and attention in the primary grades from learning about history, learning about science, learning about community, learning about things that kids might want to read about. And so then the consequence might be, and this is my worst case scenario, kids get really bored and never read for fun, don't understand how much fun it can be to get lost in a book. Now, there's a little bit of data supporting this argument. I mean, it supports this argument only if you believe that there's already been something of a switch to direct instruction and phonics. And you probably can't read this, but these are data from the 2021 PEARLs, the international comparisons. 67 countries lined up on many things, including real reading comprehension scores and reading and science scores and so forth. But these are the data about scores on how much kids like to read. Fourth grade, how much they like to read. The US comes in at 57 out of 67 countries. Sort of 47 out of 57, is that what it says? Yeah, 47 out of 57 countries, which is pretty bad. The majority of kids, as many kids say they don't like to read as say they do like to read, and the majority are kind of in the middle saying, eh. So, you know, what are we doing? Are we producing kids who are going to go on to learn by reading books, to immerse themselves in reading books, to become connoisseurs of literature or poetry, or read the New York Times for that matter, or read their local blogs for that matter? I mean, this is just a very depressing picture, I think. And these countries which the kids are in which score the lowest in liking to read are countries in which reading scores have also declined on the pearls, actually. So I think the worst potential outcome then is that we realize, oh my God, this is not good. We're producing semi-literate illiterates who, and we've got to go back and do something about it, and then phonics instruction will get thrown out, which would be a very bad thing, right? Rather than resolving the issue by integrating phonics instruction with meaning-based instruction. And then the skirmishes will begin again, and we won't really have resolved the problem. So I think, what does the science of reading tell us we should be doing is exactly the wrong question. And I think some of the better questions include, how do we ensure that first graders understand what reading is about, what it's for, why they're learning to do it, even if what they're learning to do for brief periods of time is relatively boring. If they know what it's for, they're willing to persist. I mean, actually, I don't know, I think one of the values of public schooling in this country is to ensure that kids learn how to tolerate a certain amount of boredom. It served me well, I'll tell you. They can't all become academics, but maybe some of them will. How do we, in teaching, actually integrate code with meaning, not put them next to one another? All right, we're doing foundations, we're doing some nice storybooks, but how do we integrate them so that the meaning supports the code and the code supports the meaning? How do we use writing instruction to support reading as well as an engine itself? How do we ensure lifelong engagement with literacy? And how do we stop, or at least slow, the swing of the pendulum? So thank you.